Abigail never imagined that slapping a crying black child on Flight 447 would cost her entire crew their jobs. 3 minutes after the incident, the intercom crackled with a voice she knew too well. Her father, the airline's CEO, had been watching everything through the cabin camera. Her world was about to collapse. Before we dive into this shocking story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If you believe justice should apply to everyone regardless of who they are, smash that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, this story takes turns you absolutely won't see coming. The morning sun barely broke through the Atlanta skyline when Abigail Mitchell stepped into the crew briefing room at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. At 28 years old, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed her something. Her perfectly pressed Navy uniform bore the wings of a senior flight attendant, a position she'd held for 5 years with Transatlantic Airways. What her colleagues didn't know was that she'd landed this job not through merit alone, but through a phone call her father had made to the hiring director. Aaron Mitchell, the CEO of Transatlantic Airways, had opened that door for her. But Abigail had made sure nobody knew about their connection. She wanted people to think she'd earned everything on her own, even though deep down, she knew the truth was far more complicated. She grabbed her coffee from the station and surveyed the room. Ada Williams, her closest friend among the crew, waved from the corner. Ada was 32, always cheerful, always ready to back Abigail up no matter what. They'd flown together for 3 years, and Ada had learned early on that staying on Abigail's good side made life easier. Then there was Adelaide Johnson, the junior attendant, just 23 and still learning the ropes. Adelaide was eager, nervous, always trying to do everything by the book. Abigail found her exhausting. Captain Abraham Lewis stood near the flight plan, reviewing documents. He was 50, experienced, and generally preferred to stay out of crew drama as long as flights ran smoothly. Abigail didn't think much about the day ahead. Flight 447 to Los Angeles was routine, a route she'd flown hundreds of times. 5 hours in the air, serve drinks, handle complaints, smile through the exhaustion. She'd perfected the art of looking engaged while mentally checking out. Her mind wandered to her father. They hadn't spoken in 2 months, not since their last argument about her attitude. He'd told her she was becoming entitled, that she'd forgotten where he came from, what he'd sacrificed to build his empire. She'd rolled her eyes and told him he was being dramatic. After all, she'd grown up in penthouses and private schools. His struggles in rural Alabama weren't hers. She didn't understand why he kept bringing up his past like it had anything to do with her present. Boarding began at 9 in the morning. Passengers filed through the gate, dragging suitcases and juggling carry-ons. Abigail positioned herself near the first-class entrance, her practiced smile firmly in place. She noticed them immediately. A young black woman, perhaps 25, walked down the jet bridge holding the hand of a small boy who looked about 7 years old. The woman wore a tailored blazer and carried herself with quiet dignity. The boy was dressed in a button-down shirt and khakis, noise-canceling headphones resting around his neck. They approached the first-class entrance, and Abigail felt her eyebrows raise involuntarily. She'd seen this before, she thought. People who somehow ended up in seats they couldn't possibly afford, probably through some airline glitch or mistake. The woman, whose name was Adriana Thompson, handed over her boarding pass. Abigail scanned it, then scanned it again. Seats 2A and 2B. First class. Paid in full. Abigail's smile tightened. She glanced at the boy, Aiden, who was looking around the cabin with wide, excited eyes. Something about the situation bothered her, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Or maybe she could, but didn't want to admit it. She checked the boarding pass a third time, making a show of examining it closely. Adriana noticed. Her expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She'd seen this reaction before, too. The silent question that hung in the air without being spoken aloud. Do you really belong here? Abigail finally stepped aside, allowing them to pass. As Adriana and Aidan settled into their seats, Abigail returned to the galley where Ada was preparing the beverage cart. She leaned in close and lowered her voice. Did you see who's in 2A and 2B? Ada glanced over. The mom and her kid. What about them? Abigail pursed her lips. Just seems odd, doesn't it? I mean, first class isn't cheap. Ada shrugged, not quite understanding but sensing Abigail's tone. Maybe she saved up for something special. Abigail made a noncommittal sound and turned her attention to the pre-flight checklist. But her eyes kept drifting back to row 2, where Aidan was showing his mother something on a tablet while she smiled and nodded. The truth Abigail didn't know, and wouldn't have cared to learn, was that Adriana Thompson was a pediatric surgeon at Emory University Hospital. She'd been invited to speak at a medical conference in Los Angeles about groundbreaking techniques in treating congenital heart defects in children. The first-class tickets were provided by the conference organizers. Aidan had mild autism, high-functioning but sometimes overwhelmed by sensory input. The noise-canceling headphones were a tool his mother used to help him stay calm in loud or chaotic environments. Flying made him anxious, but Adriana had learned how to guide him through it with patience and understanding. This trip was important to her professionally, but she'd almost declined because she worried about how Aidan would handle the flight. In the end, she'd decided to bring him along, to show him that he could do hard things, that the world was bigger than their neighborhood in Atlanta. Captain Abraham made the standard pre-flight announcement, his voice crackling through the overhead speakers with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The cabin doors sealed. The engines began their low rumble. Abigail moved through the aisles, checking seat belts, stowing bags, reminding passengers to turn off electronic devices. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. As the plane taxied toward the runway, she had no idea that in less than 2 hours, her entire life would implode. She had no idea that her father was sitting in his corner office at Transatlantic headquarters, casually scrolling through the live security feeds from various flights. She had no idea that he would switch to Flight 447 just as the most defining moment of her life was about to unfold. The plane lifted off the ground, Atlanta falling away beneath them, and Abigail returned to the galley to prepare for beverage service. Just another Tuesday. Just another flight. 30 minutes into the flight, the first tremors of turbulence rippled through the cabin. It wasn't severe, just enough to make the plane shudder slightly, enough to cause a few passengers to grip their armrests. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and Captain Abraham's voice came through the speakers asking everyone to remain seated. In row 2, Aidan's eyes widened. His small hands clutched the armrests, and a low hum began to emanate from his throat. It was a self-soothing technique, something his therapist had taught him to manage anxiety. The sound was soft, rhythmic, barely audible over the ambient noise of the engines. Adriana placed her hand on his shoulder and leaned close. "You're okay, sweetheart. It's just a little bumpy. Remember what we practiced?" Deep breaths. Aidan nodded, his humming continuing but his breathing starting to slow. It was working. He was managing. Abigail was halfway down the aisle when she heard it. The humming. She stopped, her eyes scanning the cabin until they landed on Aidan. Her jaw tightened. She continued her walk, pausing at row 2 and bending down slightly. "Excuse me," she said, her tone clipped. "Your son needs to be quiet. Other passengers are trying to relax." Adriana looked up, surprised. "I'm sorry, he has autism. The humming helps him calm down during turbulence. He'll stop in a moment." Abigail's expression didn't soften. "I understand, but this is a first-class cabin. We have standards. Please control him." The word control hung in the air like a blade. Adriana felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "He's not doing anything wrong. He's just a little anxious. It'll pass. Abigail straightened up, her smile now entirely gone. Excuses won't change the disruption. Handle it. She turned and walked back to the galley, leaving Adriana staring after her in disbelief. Ada had been watching from the galley entrance. When Abigail returned, Ada asked quietly, "Is everything okay?" Abigail waved a hand dismissively. "Just some kid making noise. The mother's making excuses instead of parenting." Ada didn't respond, but she felt uncomfortable. Something about Abigail's tone didn't sit right. Meanwhile, Aidan's humming had stopped. Adriana whispered encouragement to him, telling him how proud she was that he was being so brave. He smiled up at her, his fear subsiding. For a moment, it seemed like the situation had resolved itself. But Abigail wasn't finished. 10 minutes later, she returned to row 2. "Is he going to be quiet for the rest of the flight, or do we need to move you to a different section?" Adriana's eyes flashed. "Excuse me. We paid for these seats. We're not moving." Abigail leaned in slightly, her voice low enough that only Adriana could hear. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back of the plane. You know, where it's less formal." The implication was clear. Adriana's breath caught. She'd encountered racism before, subtle and overt, but never this brazenly on an airplane. "We're staying right here," she said firmly. "And I'd appreciate it if you stopped harassing my son." Abigail's smile was ice. "I'm not harassing anyone. I'm maintaining standards." She walked away again, and this time Adriana pulled out her phone. She opened her notes app and began documenting everything. The time. The words. The tone. Around them, other passengers were beginning to notice. An older white man in seat 3C frowned and leaned toward his wife. "Did you hear that, attendant? That was uncalled for." His wife nodded. "Completely inappropriate." But no one said anything aloud. Not yet. Across the aisle, a businessman named Alan Harper, white, mid-40s, was typing on his laptop but had glanced up during the exchange. He'd heard everything. He shook his head slightly, disturbed, but returned to his work. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Abigail made a third visit 15 minutes later. This time, Aidan wasn't even humming. He was looking at his tablet, watching a cartoon with his headphones on. But Abigail stopped at their row anyway. "I wanted to remind you that if there are any further disruptions, I'll have to report this to the captain." Adriana stared at her, incredulous. "He's not doing anything. He's sitting quietly. What exactly are you reporting?" Abigail didn't answer directly. She just gave a tight smile and walked away. Ada, who had been standing nearby preparing snacks, saw the whole thing. This time, she joined Abigail in the galley. "Maybe we should just leave them alone," Ada suggested gently. Abigail shot her a look. "Whose side are you on?" Ada hesitated, then said nothing. Loyalty won out over discomfort. The turbulence returned 20 minutes later, stronger this time. The plane jolted, and several passengers gasped. Aidan's hands flew to his armrests again, and the humming resumed, louder now because he was more frightened. Adriana wrapped her arm around him. "It's okay, baby. We're safe. Just a little more bumpy. You're doing great." But Abigail heard the humming from the galley. Her face flushed with anger. She stormed down the aisle, Ada trailing behind her uncertainly. They stopped at row 2, and this time both attendants stood over Adriana and Aidan, their presence intimidating. "This has to stop," Abigail said coldly. "Now." Adriana looked up at them, her protective instincts flaring. "He's scared. He's 7 years old. Leave him alone." Abigail crossed her arms. "I've given you multiple warnings. This is unacceptable behavior." Then the plane hit a severe pocket of turbulence. It dropped suddenly, and passengers cried out. Aiden screamed in fear and reached for his mother. His arm swung out reflexively, and his hand knocked into the tray Abigail was holding. The plastic cup on it tipped, and water spilled across Abigail's uniform. Cold liquid soaked into the fabric, spreading across her chest and stomach. For a moment, everything froze. Abigail looked down at her ruined uniform, then up at Aiden. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down his face. He hadn't meant to do it. It was an accident, anyone could see that. But Abigail didn't see a frightened child. She saw defiance. She saw disrespect. She saw everything she'd been silently resenting since the moment Adriana and Aiden had stepped into first class. Her hand moved before she could think. The slap echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Aiden's head snapped to the side, and a red mark immediately bloomed on his cheek. The sound of it silenced everything. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade. Aiden sat frozen, his mouth open in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Adriana screamed. "You hit my son." She lunged forward, but her seatbelt held her back. Abigail stepped backward, her hand still raised slightly, her face flushed. "He needs to learn respect." She shouted back, her voice shaking with adrenaline and rage. Passengers erupted. Someone yelled, "Are you insane?" Another pulled out their phone and started recording. Alan Harper stood up from his seat. "I saw that. That was assault." Adelaide, who had been in the back galley, came running forward. She stared at Abigail in horror. "What did you do?" Abigail's breath was coming fast now, her eyes darting around the cabin as she realized what she'd just done. But instead of apologizing, instead of showing any remorse, she doubled down. "He knocked my tray on purpose. He's been disruptive this entire flight." Adriana was sobbing now, holding Aiden's face in her hands, examining the red mark on his cheek. "He's a child. He was scared. How dare you?" Captain Abraham's voice came through the intercom, sharp and commanding. "What's going on back there? I need a crew member to report to the cockpit immediately." Ada, pale and shaking, pressed the call button and spoke into the handset. "Captain, there's been an incident in first class. You need to come back here." Abraham unbuckled and made his way through the cockpit door. When he emerged into the cabin, he saw the chaos. Passengers standing, phones out, voices raised. Adriana holding her crying son. Abigail standing rigid, her uniform soaked. Adelaide looking like she might be sick. And in the middle of it all, a 7-year-old boy with a handprint on his face. Abigail turned on her heel and retreated to the rear galley, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Ada followed, torn between self-preservation and some deeply buried instinct that what she'd just witnessed was horrifically wrong. The galley was small, cramped, filled with the metallic smell of recycled air and instant coffee. Abigail leaned against the counter, gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white. "That kid has been a problem since we boarded," she hissed to Ada, her voice low and venomous. "Did you see how he acted? Constantly making noise, disrupting everyone. His mother refuses to discipline him. What was I supposed to do?" Ada hesitated, her face pale. "Abigail, you hit a child. You can't just hit someone's kid." Abigail spun to face her, eyes blazing. "He assaulted me first. He threw water all over me. That's destruction of property, or something. I was defending myself." The logic was so twisted, so desperately grasping, that Ada couldn't even formulate a response. She just stood there, mouth slightly open, trying to process how her friend could possibly justify what had just happened. Abigail pressed on, her words tumbling out faster now. "These people think they can do whatever they want, act however they want, and nobody's allowed to say anything because we're scared of being called racist. Well, I'm not scared. I held her to the same standard I'd hold anyone, and if she doesn't like it, that's her problem. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Ada felt sick. She'd known Abigail had opinions, little comments here and there that made Ada uncomfortable, but she'd always brushed them off as jokes or stress. This wasn't a joke. This was something else entirely. Adelaide appeared in the galley doorway, her young face stricken. "Captain Abraham wants to see you up front. Now." Abigail straightened her uniform, trying to compose herself. "Fine. I'll explain everything. He'll understand." She pushed past Adelaide, who stepped aside quickly. As Abigail disappeared toward the cockpit, Adelaide turned to Ada. "Did she really just hit that little boy?" Ada couldn't meet her eyes. It all happened so fast. The kid knocked her tray. She reacted. "It's complicated." Adelaide's voice rose. "It's not complicated. You can't hit a child. What's wrong with you two?" Ada flinched. "Don't talk to me like that. You're junior crew. You don't know how things work yet." Adelaide stared at her in disbelief. "I know right from wrong." "Apparently, that's more than you can say." Up in first class, Captain Abraham was crouched beside Adriana and Aiden. His face was grave. Aiden had stopped crying, but his cheek was still bright red, the outline of fingers visible against his brown skin. Adriana was shaking, partly from rage, partly from the adrenaline crash. Abraham spoke softly. "Ma'am, I am so deeply sorry for what just happened. I need you to know that this is absolutely not acceptable behavior, and there will be consequences." Adriana looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Consequences? Your flight attendant just assaulted my 7-year-old son in front of a plane full of witnesses. I want her arrested the moment we land." Abraham nodded slowly. "I understand. I'll be contacting ground authorities immediately. In the meantime, I need to get her away from passengers. Is there anything I can do for you right now? Medical assistance, anything?" Adriana shook her head. "Just keep her away from us." Abraham stood and made his way back to the galley area where Abigail was waiting. She intercepted him before he could speak. "Captain, I need to explain what happened. That child has been out of control since takeoff. His mother refused to manage him. He became physical with me, threw water on me, and I reacted instinctively to protect myself. I know it looks bad, but context matters." Abraham studied her face. He'd flown with Abigail dozens of times over the past 5 years. She'd always been professional, if a bit cold. He'd never seen her lose control like this. Part of him wanted to believe her version, wanted to think there was some justification. It would make the paperwork easier. It would make his life easier. But he'd seen the boy's face. He'd seen the witnesses recording on their phones. He'd heard Adriana's account. "Abigail, you struck a passenger. A child. There's no context that makes that okay." Abigail's expression hardened. "So you're taking their side?" Abraham sighed. "I'm not taking sides. I'm following policy. You're going to finish this flight because federal regulations won't let me remove you mid-air, but the moment we land, you're done. Security will be waiting." Abigail felt panic rising in her chest. "You can't do that. I've been with this airline for 5 years. My record is spotless." Abraham's voice dropped. "Your record was spotless. Not anymore. Now get back to the rear galley and stay there. I don't want you near passengers for the rest of this flight." He turned to leave, but Abigail grabbed his arm. "Please. Let me apologize to them. Let me fix this." Abraham pulled his arm free. "You've done enough. Stay in the back." He walked away, leaving Abigail standing alone in the narrow aisle. She returned to the rear galley where Ada and Adelaide were whispering urgently. They fell silent when she entered. Abigail looked between them. I'm being made the scapegoat here. That woman is going to sue the airline, probably claim emotional distress or whatever, and they're going to throw me under the bus to avoid bad publicity. Ada bit her lip. Maybe if you just apologized. Abigail cut her off. Apologize? For what? For doing my job. For maintaining order. No. I'm not apologizing. Adelaide shook her head in disgust and left the galley. Ada stayed, but the look in her eyes had changed. Doubt had crept in. What none of them knew, what Abigail couldn't possibly have imagined, was that at that very moment, 3 miles above the ground, another set of eyes was watching. In his corner office at Transatlantic headquarters in downtown Atlanta, Aaron Mitchell sat behind his massive mahogany desk, staring at a wall of monitors. Each screen showed a live feed from different flights currently in the air. It was a security feature he'd implemented years ago, a way to monitor crew behavior and passenger safety in real time. Most days, he barely glanced at them. But today, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he'd been watching Flight 447. He'd seen the entire incident unfold. He'd watched his daughter, the child he'd raised, the girl he'd given every advantage to, slap a black boy across the face for the crime of being scared during turbulence. And now, as he sat in his leather chair with his hands clasped in front of his mouth, Aaron Mitchell was making the hardest decision of his life. Aaron Mitchell hadn't always been a man who commanded boardrooms and controlled fleets of aircraft. 55 years old now, with silver threading through his close-cropped hair and reading glasses perched on his desk, he looked every bit the successful executive. But his story had started in a place so far removed from corporate towers that sometimes even he had trouble reconciling the journey. He'd grown up in rural Alabama, the son of sharecroppers who worked land they'd never owned. His childhood home had been a 3-room shack with gaps in the floorboards wide enough to see the red clay dirt beneath. He'd walked 4 miles to a segregated school where textbooks were hand-me-downs from the white school across town, pages torn and information outdated. He'd experienced poverty so deep that hunger was just a constant background hum, something you learned to ignore like the mosquitoes in summer. But worse than the poverty had been the hatred. He remembered being 9 years old, standing at a bus stop with his mother, waiting to go into town. A white woman had approached the stop and, upon seeing them, had spit at his mother's feet and called her a word that still made Aaron's stomach turn decades later. His mother hadn't reacted, had just held his hand tighter and looked straight ahead. Later, when he'd asked why she didn't fight back, she told him something he'd never forgotten. "Baby, sometimes surviving is the only victory we get. But you're going to do more than survive. You're going to thrive." She'd been right, though she hadn't lived long enough to see it. Cancer had taken her when Aaron was 17, and his father had followed 2 years later, heart giving out in the middle of a cotton field. Aaron had clawed his way through community college, then state university, working 3 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night. He'd studied business and aviation management, fascinated by the idea of flight, by the freedom it represented. After graduation, he tried to get hired by every major airline. Rejection after rejection. Too many of the interviews had ended with vague excuses that barely masked the real reason. Finally, a small regional carrier had taken a chance on him, and he'd started in their logistics department. He'd worked obsessively, proving himself again and again, moving up slowly through sheer competence and willpower that bordered on manic. By 35, he was managing operations. By 40, he'd secured enough investors to start his own airline. Transatlantic Airways had been born from his vision of an airline that treated every passenger with dignity, regardless of their skin color, background, or bank account. The company had grown beyond his wildest expectations. What started with 3 leased planes now commanded a fleet of over 200 aircraft, flying routes across the United States and into Europe. Aaron's personal worth had climbed into the billions. He'd built something real, something lasting. And he'd done it while maintaining an ironclad principle that had guided every decision. No discrimination. Ever. He'd fired executives who made racist jokes. He'd terminated partnerships with vendors who had discriminatory practices. His employees knew that bigotry was the fastest way to end a career at Transatlantic. It wasn't just policy. It was personal. Every firing, every stand he took, was for the 9-year-old boy who'd watched his mother get spit on and been powerless to stop it. He'd married young, to a woman named Alberta who came from money. The marriage had been a mistake from the start, a union born more from his desire to prove he belonged in her world than from any real connection. They'd had one child. Abigail. She'd been born into privilege that Aaron could never have imagined as a child. Private schools, piano lessons, summer camps in Switzerland, a BMW for her 16th birthday. He'd wanted to give her everything he'd never had. But somewhere along the way, he'd failed to give her the most important thing. An understanding of where she came from. An appreciation for struggle. A sense that her advantages were borrowed, not earned. The divorce had come when Abigail was 12. Alberta had taken her to live in a penthouse in Buckhead, Atlanta's wealthiest neighborhood. Aaron had tried to stay involved, but his work consumed him, and Alberta made sure Abigail grew up in a bubble where people like Aaron's parents might as well have existed on another planet. Abigail had gone to college at Emory, studied hospitality management, and then had asked her father for a job. He'd been hesitant, had suggested she work somewhere else first to prove herself. She'd accused him of not supporting her, of being ashamed of her. In a moment of weakness, he'd made the call to his hiring director. Abigail had gotten the job. But he'd told her she was on her own, that he wouldn't interfere, that she'd have to succeed or fail on her own merits. He wasn't sure she'd ever really believed him. Now, sitting in his office on this ordinary Tuesday morning, Aaron cycled through the security feeds almost absently. Flight 319 showed passengers settling in for a transatlantic journey to London. Flight 205 had turbulence, nothing serious, crew handling it well. Flight 447, Atlanta to Los Angeles. He almost clicked past it, but something made him pause. The camera angle showed first class. He saw a young black woman and a small boy. He saw a flight attendant approaching them, and even without audio, he could read the body language. Tension. The attendant walked away. Returned. Walked away again. Aaron leaned forward, frowning. He increased the volume slightly, though the audio quality from cabin cameras was poor. He couldn't make out words, but he could hear tone. Sharp. Dismissive. Then came the turbulence. He watched the plane jostle. Watched the boy reach out in fear. Watched his hand hit a tray. Watched water spill. And then he watched the flight attendant's hand come down hard across the child's face. Aaron's entire body went rigid. His breath stopped. The boy's head snapped to the side, and even through the grainy security footage, Aaron could see the impact. For a moment, his mind refused to process what he'd just witnessed. Then the camera angle shifted slightly as other passengers stood, and he got a clear view of the flight attendant's face. His daughter. His Abigail. The girl he'd raised, whose first steps he'd videotaped, whose school plays he'd attended, whose college graduation had made him cry. That girl had just struck a black child for the crime of being afraid. Aaron's hands began to shake. He rewound the footage, watched it again, hoping somehow he'd been mistaken. But there was no mistake. The slap was clear. The context was clear. A child had accidentally knocked over water during turbulence, and a flight attendant had responded with violence. Not just any flight attendant. His daughter. The daughter of a man who'd built an entire company on the principle that black people deserved dignity and respect. The irony was so bitter he could taste it. He'd escaped poverty and racism, had built an empire, had given his child every advantage. And she'd used those advantages to become exactly what he'd spent his life fighting against. He picked up his phone with trembling fingers and called his head of security. "Pull all footage from Flight 447 immediately. I want every angle, every minute from boarding to now. Send it to legal." The security director, a woman named Aileen, responded with confusion. "Sir, is there a problem?" Aaron's voice was tight. "Just do it. Now." Next call, his legal team. "I need termination papers drawn up. Multiple employees. I'll send names in 10 minutes. The lawyer tried to ask questions, but Aaron cut him off. "I don't have time to explain. We're about to have a situation, and I need us to be prepared." Third call, his public relations director. "Clear your afternoon. We're going to need a statement prepared about an in-flight incident. It's going to go public, probably within the hour. I need us ahead of it." His finger hovered over the contact for the cockpit of Flight 447. This was the call that would change everything. Once he made it, there was no going back. His daughter's career would be over. Her life, as she knew it, would be over. And his relationship with her, already strained, would likely shatter completely. But in his mind, he kept seeing that little boy's face. Kept seeing the fear, then the impact, then the shock. That could have been him at 7 years old. That could have been any black child whose only crime was existing in a space where someone else decided they didn't belong. Aaron had spent his entire adult life making sure people like his daughter couldn't use power to hurt people like that little boy. It didn't matter that she was his blood. It didn't matter that he loved her. What mattered was what was right. He pressed the contact. The line connected. A voice answered. "Flight 447, Captain Lewis speaking." Aaron's voice, when he spoke, was steel. "Captain, this is Aaron Mitchell, CEO of Transatlantic Airways. I need you to patch me through to the cabin intercom system. Immediately." There was a pause. "Sir, is everything all right?" Aaron closed his eyes. "No, Captain. Nothing is all right. But it's about to be made right. Patch me through." Should Aaron have handled this differently? Could there have been another way? Comment number 1 if you think a father should put justice above family, or comment number 2 if you believe he should have protected his daughter first. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The question is, when the CEO's voice comes through those speakers, will Abigail realize just how much she's about to lose? Stay with us. The slight crackle of the intercom system cut through the murmur of agitated voices in the cabin of Flight 447. Passengers who'd been whispering urgently to each other, who'd been recording videos on their phones, who'd been comforting the crying child in row 2, all fell silent as the speakers hummed to life. Captain Abraham's voice had become familiar over the past hour of flight time, but this wasn't his voice. This was someone else. Someone whose tone carried weight that couldn't be faked. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Aaron Mitchell. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Transatlantic Airways." In the rear galley, Abigail's blood turned to ice. Her hand, which had been reaching for a bottle of water, froze mid-air. That voice. She knew that voice better than almost any other sound in the world. It was the voice that had read her bedtime stories when she was small, that had cheered at her soccer games, that had argued with her mother during the divorce, that had grown increasingly distant over the past few years. Her father. Speaking to the entire plane. But how? Why? Her mind raced, trying to make connections that didn't want to form. Ada, standing beside her, saw the color drain from Abigail's face. "What's wrong?" Ada whispered. Abigail couldn't answer. Her throat had closed. Aaron's voice continued, measured and deliberate. I want to address an incident that occurred approximately 3 minutes ago in the first-class cabin of this aircraft. I'm speaking to you now because I personally witnessed it through our onboard security camera system. Passengers looked at each other, confused. Security cameras? Recording them? Aaron pressed on. I watched a member of my flight crew, a senior attendant, physically strike a 7-year-old passenger across the face. I watched this child, who was frightened during turbulence, accidentally knock over a beverage tray. And I watched an adult respond to that accident with violence. The cabin erupted in whispers. People pulled out phones again, this time not to record the aftermath but to capture this moment. The CEO of the airline, speaking in real time about an assault on his own plane. Abigail's legs felt weak. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Her father couldn't possibly be talking about her. He didn't even know she was on this flight. Did he? Her mind scrambled for explanations, for escape routes, but there were none. She was trapped at 35,000 feet with nowhere to run. Aaron's next words detonated like a bomb. That flight attendant is my daughter. Abigail Mitchell. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps echoed through the cabin. In row 2, Adriana's head snapped up, her eyes wide. The CEO's daughter? The businessman Alan Harper stood from his seat, his mouth hanging open. All around the plane, passengers turned to look toward the rear of the aircraft, trying to see if they could spot her. In the galley, Ada took a step back from Abigail as if proximity might contaminate her. "He's your father," she hissed. "The CEO is your father and you never told anyone?" Abigail couldn't form words. Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and bitter. This was exposure beyond anything she could have imagined. Not just her actions, but her identity, her privilege, all of it laid bare. Aaron continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd spent his life fighting for something he believed in. "I want every person on this aircraft to understand something. I built Transatlantic Airways on a principle that might sound simple but has guided every decision I've ever made in this company. Every human being deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, background, or circumstances. I grew up as a black child in the segregated South. I experienced firsthand what it feels like to be judged, dismissed, and degraded because of the color of my skin. I vowed that if I ever had the power to create a space where that didn't happen, I would. This airline was supposed to be that space." In row 2, Adriana had her arms wrapped around Aiden, who was confused by all the attention but could feel his mother's body shaking. She was crying, but not from anger anymore. From something else. Relief, maybe. Validation. Someone with power was acknowledging what had happened. Someone was taking her side. Aaron's voice grew harder. "I take full responsibility for the fact that my own daughter, a person I raised and provided every advantage to, has violated that principle in the most egregious way possible. I failed to instill in her the values that should have guided her actions today. I gave her privilege without giving her character. That failure is mine." Abigail sobbed openly now, her hand over her mouth, trying to muffle the sounds. This was humiliation beyond anything she'd ever experienced. Her father was disowning her publicly, in front of hundreds of strangers, in a moment that was undoubtedly being recorded and would be replayed thousands of times. Ada stood frozen, unsure whether to comfort her friend or distance herself. The choice was made for her when Aaron's next words came through. "Effective immediately, I am terminating the employment of Abigail Mitchell. She will never work for this airline again. She will never fly as a passenger on this airline again." Her actions today were not just unprofessional. They were morally reprehensible. But he wasn't done. "Senior Flight Attendant Ada Williams, you were present during multiple interactions leading up to this incident. You stood by and watched as my daughter harassed a mother and her child. You did nothing to intervene. You enabled this behavior through your silence. You are also terminated, effective immediately. Ada's gasp was audible. Her face went white. No, she whispered. No, no, no. She looked at Abigail with sudden hatred. You said nothing would happen. You said you'd handle it. Abigail was too devastated to respond. Ada's voice rose. This is your fault. You ruined my life. Aaron wasn't finished. Captain Abraham Lewis, you were informed of an assault on a minor passenger in your aircraft. Rather than taking decisive action to protect that child and his mother, you attempted to minimize the situation. You allowed the offending crew member to remain on duty. You prioritized convenience over justice. Captain Lewis, you are terminated, effective immediately. In the cockpit, Abraham closed his eyes. 30 years of service, gone. He'd known the moment he tried to de-escalate instead of acting decisively. He'd known he was making the wrong choice. But he'd been tired, he'd wanted an easy solution, and now he was paying the price. Junior Flight Attendant Adelaide Johnson, Aaron said, and Adelaide, who'd been listening from the forward galley, felt her heart stop. You attempted to intervene. You recognized immediately that what was happening was wrong, and you tried to stop it. You are suspended pending a full investigation, but I want you to know that your instincts were correct. We need more crew members like you, not fewer. Adelaide felt tears of relief prick her eyes. She wasn't proud of how long it had taken her to speak up, but at least she tried. The cabin had gone silent again, every passenger hanging on Aaron's words. To the mother and child who were victimized today, I cannot undo what happened. I cannot take back the fear and pain my daughter inflicted. But I can promise you this. There will be consequences. Legal consequences, financial consequences, and personal consequences. I will do everything in my power to make this right, though I know that's inadequate. You came onto my airline expecting safety and dignity. You received violence and prejudice. That is unforgivable. Abigail grabbed the intercom handset in the rear galley, her hands shaking so badly she could barely press the button. Dad, she screamed into it, her voice breaking. Daddy, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Please don't do this to me. Her voice echoed through the cabin, raw and desperate. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some felt pity. Most didn't. Aaron's response was quiet but firm. Abigail, you slapped a child because of the color of his skin. There's no explanation that makes that acceptable. There's no apology that erases it. When this plane lands in Los Angeles, airport security will be waiting. You'll be escorted off the aircraft and turned over to police. I hope you use the next 2 hours to think about the person you've become. The intercom clicked off. The silence that followed was deafening. Abigail collapsed against the galley counter, her body racked with sobs. Ada stood apart from her now, arms crossed, face twisted with anger and fear. In the cockpit, Abraham stared straight ahead, his co-pilot shooting him uncertain glances. And in first class, Adriana held her son close, processing what had just happened. The passengers around her had broken into applause. It started with Alan Harper and spread through the cabin like wildfire. People were clapping, some standing, acknowledging what Aaron Mitchell had just done. He'd chosen principle over blood. He'd chosen a stranger's child over his own daughter. The remaining 2 hours of Flight 447 felt longer than any flight in recorded history. Time moved differently when everyone aboard knew they were part of something that would be dissected, analyzed, and remembered. The fired crew members still had to perform their duties because federal aviation regulations left no room for mid-flight personnel changes. Abigail remained confined to the rear galley, forbidden from entering passenger areas. She sat on the small jump seat, her face buried in her hands, occasionally shaking with silent sobs. Ada handled first-class beverage service alone, her movements mechanical, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. Every time a passenger met her eyes, she looked away. Captain Abraham flew the plane with the steady professionalism of 3 decades of experience, but his hands trembled slightly on the controls. His co-pilot, a younger man named Albert who'd been silent through the entire ordeal, didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Adelaide had been promoted on the spot, thrust into senior attendant duties she wasn't fully prepared for. But she rose to the challenge with a grace that surprised even her. She moved through the cabin offering water, snacks, apologies to anyone who'd been disturbed by the chaos. She checked on Adriana and Aiden every 15 minutes, asking if they needed anything, if there was any way she could help. Adriana appreciated the gesture. This young woman, barely out of her teens, had been the only crew member to immediately recognize that something was horribly wrong. "Thank you," Adriana said during one check-in. "For trying to stop it." Adelaide's eyes filled with tears. "I should have done more. I should have been louder." Adriana shook her head. "You did what you could. That's more than most people manage." The passengers had transformed from strangers sharing a metal tube to witnesses of history. Phones were out constantly, recording videos, typing posts, streaming live to social media. The plane had Wi-Fi, a feature that had once seemed like a luxury but now felt like a curse to the fired crew and a blessing to everyone else. Within 20 minutes of Aaron's announcement, #Flight 447 was trending on every platform. News outlets scrambled to confirm details. Transatlantic Airways stock dropped initially as algorithms registered negative sentiment, then surged as the full story became clear. Investors loved decisive leadership. The market loved accountability. By the time the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, transatlantic stock had risen 12%. In row 3, Alan Harper had closed his laptop and introduced himself properly to Adriana. "I'm a civil rights attorney," he explained, handing her a business card. "What happened to your son is textbook assault and battery, with clear racial motivations. If you want to pursue legal action, I'd like to represent you. Pro bono. No fees." Adriana looked at the card, then at Alan. "Why pro bono?" Alan's expression was serious. "Because cases like this need to be visible. They need to cost the perpetrators something. Not just the individual, but the systems that enable them. And because I have a daughter around your son's age. If someone ever hurt her like that, I'd want someone to stand beside me." Adriana nodded slowly. "Okay. Yes. Let's do it." Other passengers volunteered themselves as witnesses. A woman named Aileen, black, in her 40s, approached Adriana's row. "I saw everything. I recorded video. I'll testify if you need me to." Adriana thanked her. Aileen sat down in an empty seat across the aisle. "Can I tell you something?" she asked quietly. Adriana nodded. Eileen's voice dropped. 2 years ago, my daughter and I were on a flight. Different airline. She's 12, has cerebral palsy, uses a wheelchair. The gate agent questioned whether she could fly, implied she was a safety risk. Then on the plane, a passenger complained that her wheelchair was blocking the aisle, even though it was properly stowed. The flight attendant made us move to the very back row, away from our assigned seats. My daughter cried the whole flight. I filed a complaint. Nothing happened. The airline sent me a $50 voucher and a form letter apology. Adriana felt anger flare on Eileen's behalf. That's exactly why we need to push back. These things keep happening because there are no real consequences. Aileen nodded. That's why I'm offering to help. Maybe your son's case will be different. Maybe because the CEO himself took action, because it's so public, maybe this time something will actually change. The two women sat in silence for a moment, united by the shared experience of watching their children suffer discrimination. Then Aileen reached across and squeezed Adriana's hand. Your boy is brave. You're brave. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. In the rear galley, Ada had worked up the courage to approach Abigail. This is your fault, Ada said, her voice low and venomous. I went along with you because I thought you knew what you were doing. I thought you had some kind of protection because you acted so confident. Now my career is over. I have rent due in 2 weeks. I have student loans. I have nothing. Abigail looked up at her with red, swollen eyes. I didn't know he was watching. I didn't know about the cameras. How was I supposed to know? Ada's laugh was bitter. You shouldn't have needed to know. You hit a child. That's wrong no matter who's watching. Abigail's grief twisted into defensiveness. You stood right there with me. You back me up every time. Don't act like you're innocent. Ada's face flushed. I backed you up because you made it seem like you were right. You kept saying he was disruptive, that the mother was making excuses. I believed you. Abigail stood, wobbly but defiant. You believed me because you wanted to. You were thinking the same things I was, you just don't want to admit it now that there are consequences. The truth of that statement hung between them. Ada had been complicit, not just in her actions but in her thoughts. She'd gone along with Abigail's prejudice because confronting it would have required confronting her own biases. Now they were both paying the price, and neither wanted to shoulder the blame. Adelaide appeared in the galley doorway. Ada, you need to prepare for landing. And Abigail, the captain says you're to remain here until we reach the gate and security boards. Abigail slumped back onto the jump seat. This was real. In less than an hour, she'd be in handcuffs. Her life as she'd known it was over. All because of one moment, one slap, one child. Except it wasn't really one moment, was it? It was every casual racist joke she'd laughed at. Every microaggression she'd committed without thinking. Every time she'd seen a black person and made assumptions. Every advantage she'd taken for granted because her father's struggles weren't hers. All of it had been building to this. She just hadn't realized it until now. In his Atlanta office, Aaron had been monitoring social media and news coverage. His assistant had compiled clips. Video from passengers showing the slap, showing Aiden's tear-stained face, showing Adriana's anguish. Audio of Aaron's announcement, played and replayed on news programs. Commentators debated whether he'd been too harsh or not harsh enough. Some called him a hero for putting principle over family. Others called him cruel for publicly destroying his daughter. Aaron didn't care about either camp. He'd done what he had to do. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. He pulled up a photo on his phone, one from years ago. Abigail at 5 years old, sitting on his shoulders, laughing at something. She'd been innocent then, full of joy. Where had it gone wrong? When had privilege curdled into entitlement? When had comfort bred contempt for those with less? He'd released a company-wide memo an hour earlier. All transatlantic employees were required to undergo additional anti-racism training. A passenger protection hotline was being established, with reports going directly to an independent oversight board. He'd personally committed $10 million to a fund for victims of discrimination, whether on his airline or others. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting, concerned about the PR implications. Aaron had been blunt with them. If any of you have a problem with how I handled this, submit your resignation. I'll accept it immediately. I won't run an airline where abuse is tolerated, and I sure as hell won't run one where my own blood gets special treatment. We hold the line here, or we don't hold it at all. Not a single director had resigned. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles. The California coast appeared through the windows, golden and beautiful in the afternoon sun. Passengers started gathering belongings, checking phones, preparing for landing. But the usual pre-landing chatter was muted. Everyone knew what was coming. Security would board. Arrests would be made. This flight that had started like any other would end like none ever had. Adriana held Aiden close. He'd calmed down considerably, distracted by the kindness of strangers who'd given him snacks and a stuffed animal someone had in their carry-on. But the red mark on his cheek remained, a physical reminder of what had happened. She'd taken photos, documenting it from multiple angles. Evidence. Alan had told her it was important. This wasn't just about accountability for Abigail. It was about setting precedent. It was about sending a message to every other flight attendant, gate agent, pilot, and passenger that this behavior would not be tolerated. The landing was smooth. Captain Abraham guided the plane onto the runway with practiced ease, one of thousands of landings he'd performed over his career. This would be his last. The plane taxied toward the gate, and through the windows, passengers could see police vehicles and news trucks. The media had descended en masse. This wasn't just a local story anymore. This was national, possibly international. The plane came to a stop. The seatbelt sign dinged off. But Captain Abraham's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Law enforcement will be boarding to handle an official matter. Once they've concluded their business, we'll begin normal deplaning procedures. Thank you for your patience." The cabin door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and 6 police officers filed aboard. They were led by a sergeant named Alan, a tall man with gray at his temples and the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much. Behind him, 2 female officers and 3 males moved with the careful precision of people trained for any situation. The passengers remained seated, watching silently as the officers made their way down the aisle. Sergeant Allen spoke briefly with Adelaide, who pointed toward the rear galley. The officers nodded and continued. In the rear galley, Abigail heard their approach. The heavy footsteps, the clink of equipment on their belts. She stood up from the jump seat, her legs unsteady. Ada had retreated to the far corner, trying to make herself invisible. The sergeant entered the galley. "Abigail Mitchell." His voice was neutral, professional. Abigail nodded, unable to speak. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." The reality of it hit her like a physical blow. This was actually happening. She was being arrested. "Please," she whispered. "Can we do this outside? Not in front of everyone." The sergeant's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, turn around." Abigail complied, her body shaking. She felt the cold metal of handcuffs close around her wrists, heard the ratcheting click as they tightened. The sergeant began reading her rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Abigail's mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. She was a senior flight attendant, a professional, the daughter of a billionaire. People like her didn't get arrested. Except she was. The sergeant finished the Miranda warning. "Do you understand these rights as I've read them to you?" Abigail nodded. "I need a verbal response, ma'am." Her voice came out as a croak. "Yes." The sergeant gestured to one of the female officers. "Officer Adelaide, escort the suspect off the aircraft." The irony of the officer sharing a name with the junior flight attendant wasn't lost on anyone. They led Abigail out of the galley and down the aisle. Every eye in the plane watched her. Some passengers recorded the perp walk on their phones. Others sat in solemn silence. A few muttered comments under their breath. Abigail kept her eyes on the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Tears streamed down her face, dripping onto her ruined uniform. As they passed row 2, she couldn't help but glance up. Adriana sat there, holding Aiden, watching Abigail with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pity. It was something else. Disappointment, maybe. The look you give someone who had every advantage and squandered it on hatred. Abigail wanted to say something, wanted to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. The officers kept her moving. Behind her, 2 more officers remained to escort Ada Williams and Captain Abraham Lewis. Ada was crying openly, begging. "Please, I didn't do anything. I just stood there. That's not a crime." The sergeant handling her case was a woman named Adriana, and her voice was firm. "You're not under arrest, ma'am. But you are being escorted off the property as a terminated employee. You need to come with us." Ada's begging turned to anger. "This is discrimination. You can't do this." Officer Adriana raised an eyebrow. "You want to talk about discrimination? Really? Right now?" Ada fell silent. Captain Abraham went without protest. He'd accepted his fate. The 3 of them were led off the plane in succession, each escorted by officers, each facing an uncertain future. At the gate, the scene was chaotic. News cameras jostled for position. Reporters shouted questions. Airport security tried to maintain a perimeter. And standing in the middle of it all was Aaron Mitchell. He'd flown in from Atlanta the moment he'd made his announcement, taking a private jet that had gotten him to LAX just minutes before Flight 447 landed. He stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of controlled emotion. When Abigail emerged from the jet bridge in handcuffs, escorted by officers, she saw him immediately. "Daddy," she screamed, her voice breaking. "Daddy, please. Help me." She tried to run toward him, but the officers held her firmly. Aaron didn't move. Didn't reach for her. Didn't show any sign of the anguish that was tearing him apart inside. Abigail was sobbing now, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "How could you do this to me? I'm your daughter. Doesn't that mean anything?" Aaron's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet enough that only those close could hear. But his words cut deeper than any shout. "You're my daughter. And I love you. But that little boy you hurt is someone's son too. His mother loves him just as much as I love you. Maybe more, because she seems to have raised him with kindness. I gave you everything, Abigail. Everything except consequences. That ends today." Abigail's face twisted with rage and pain. "I didn't come from nothing like you did. I didn't grow up poor and oppressed. Stop expecting me to carry your trauma." Aaron's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Hurt, maybe. That's the problem," he said softly. "I gave you a life without struggle, and you learned to have contempt for those who do struggle. I gave you privilege without teaching you responsibility. That's my failure as a father. But your actions today, those are your failure as a human being." Abigail tried one more time. "So you're choosing them over me? You're choosing strangers over your own blood?" Aaron stepped closer, close enough that the cameras couldn't capture his words. "I'm choosing what's right. Something I should have taught you to do a long time ago. When you get out of jail, if you want to have a conversation about how to be a better person, I'll be there. But right now, you need to face what you've done." He stepped back and nodded to the officers. They led Abigail away, her screams echoing through the terminal. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Aaron stood like a statue, watching his daughter disappear into a police van. The other passengers began to deplane. As Adriana and Aiden reached the gate area, Aaron was there. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with Aiden's. The boy was holding his mother's hand tightly, uncertain. Aaron's voice was gentle. "Young man, my name is Aaron. I want to tell you how sorry I am for what happened to you today." Aiden looked at him with wide eyes. "Are you really the boss of the whole airplane?" Aaron's lips twitched in a sad smile. "I am. And I failed you today. Someone who worked for me hurt you, and that should never have happened. I promise you, it will never happen again." Aiden thought about this for a moment. "My mommy says that sometimes people do mean things because they're hurting inside. Is that lady hurting inside? Aaron's throat tightened. This child, this beautiful, empathetic child who'd just been assaulted, was trying to understand his attacker's pain. Yes, Aaron said quietly. I think she is hurting. But that doesn't excuse what she did to you. You didn't deserve to be hurt because she's hurting. Do you understand? Aiden nodded seriously. I think so. Aaron turned his attention to Adriana. Dr. Thompson, I'd like to discuss compensation, counseling for your son, anything you need. I know money can't undo this, but I want to try to make it right. Adriana studied him carefully. She saw genuine remorse in his face, but also strength. This man had just publicly destroyed his daughter's life to protect strangers. That took courage most people didn't have. I appreciate that, she said. But what I want more than money is change. Real change. Not just in your airline, but everywhere. I want my son to grow up in a world where this doesn't keep happening. Aaron nodded slowly. Then let's make that happen. Together. He stood and handed her a business card. My personal number. Call me tomorrow. We'll start figuring out what real change looks like. Alan Harper approached, introducing himself. Mr. Mitchell, I'm representing Dr. Thompson. I want to make sure we're clear that any settlement discussions don't preclude criminal charges against your daughter. Aaron met his eyes. I wouldn't want them to. Abigail needs to face the legal consequences of her actions. That's not negotiable. Alan looked surprised. Most CEOs would be trying to make this go away quietly. Aaron's smile was grim. I'm not most CEOs. My daughter assaulted a child on my watch, in my airline, using power I indirectly gave her. Making it go away would be another failure. We don't hide this. We face it. 1 week later, the world had not stopped talking about Flight 447. The story had metastasized across every form of media, spawning think pieces, hot takes, documentaries in progress, and countless social media debates. Abigail Mitchell had become a symbol, though not the kind anyone would want to be. Her face was recognizable now, her name synonymous with privileged racism. She couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, photographed, harassed. She'd been released on bail, $50,000 that her mother had posted, and was living in her mother's apartment under what amounted to house arrest. The criminal charges were proceeding swiftly. The Los Angeles District Attorney, sensing a high-profile win, had assigned a senior prosecutor to the case. Abigail's lawyers, expensive ones hired with her father's money though he'd made clear it was the last financial help she'd receive, had advised her to plead guilty. The video evidence was ironclad. Going to trial would only make things worse. She'd followed their advice. In a brief court appearance, she'd stood before a judge and admitted to assault and battery on a minor. The judge, a stern black woman in her 60s named Alberta, had looked at Abigail with barely concealed disgust. You're 28 years old. An adult. You had every advantage in life. And you used those advantages to hurt a child. I'm sentencing you to 6 months in county jail, 2 years of probation following release, mandatory anger management counseling, and 200 hours of community service to be served at youth centers working with at-risk children. Maybe spending time with kids who've actually faced hardship will teach you something about perspective. Abigail had nodded numbly, unable to speak. 6 months. It could have been worse. The maximum sentence for what she'd done was a year. But 6 months felt like an eternity. The civil lawsuit filed by Adriana's legal team was settled quickly. Abigail's lawyers wanted it off the table before she went to jail, wanted one less thing hanging over her head. The settlement amount was confidential, sealed by court order at Adriana's request. But rumors put it somewhere in the 7-figure range. Abigail's trust fund, which her father had set up for her years ago, was drained entirely to cover it. Aaron had refused to contribute anything beyond the initial lawyer fees. You earned this debt, he told her during their one phone call after her guilty plea. "You'll pay it yourself." Abigail had hung up on him. Ada Williams' fate was less legally complicated but perhaps more crushing in its mundanity. She wasn't charged with any crime, there was no law against standing by and doing nothing. But she was unemployable. Every airline she applied to rejected her within hours. Background checks flagged her involvement in Flight 447, and no company wanted the liability. She tried to rebrand, posting an apology video on social media where she tearfully explained that she'd been following Abigail's lead, that she hadn't understood the situation, that she was deeply sorry. The internet's response was merciless. Comments called her complicit, spineless, a coward hiding behind tears. The video was ratioed so badly she eventually deleted it. She'd moved back in with her parents in rural Georgia, taking a job at a local diner for minimum wage plus tips. At night, she lay awake replaying the events of that flight, wondering at what point she could have changed the outcome. The answer was always the same. Any point. She could have spoken up at any point, and she hadn't. Captain Abraham Lewis' fall was similarly complete. 30 years of service erased by one decision to prioritize convenience over justice. His wife had left him, unable to forgive the fact that his cowardice had cost them their comfortable retirement. His pension had been reduced significantly due to termination for cause. He lived alone now in a small apartment, surviving on what little remained of his savings. But unlike Ada, Abraham had chosen a different path for his remorse. He'd begun volunteering at community centers, talking to young people about the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. He'd written an op-ed for a major newspaper titled, "The Day I Chose Convenience Over Justice," which had gone viral. In it, he'd been brutally honest about his failure, about the calculations he'd made, about how he'd told himself he was preventing further disruption when really he was just avoiding conflict. The piece had resonated with thousands of people who recognized their own cowardice in his story. Adelaide Johnson had been fully reinstated after a thorough investigation confirmed she'd tried to intervene. Transatlantic had promoted her to senior flight attendant and made her the face of their new anti-discrimination training program. She appeared in company videos, spoke at employee conferences, and had become something of a minor celebrity within the airline industry. She handled the attention with grace, always redirecting praise away from herself and toward the need for systemic change. "I didn't do anything heroic," she said in every interview. "I just recognized that what was happening was wrong. That should be the baseline, not something we celebrate." Transatlantic Airways itself had undergone a transformation. Erin's swift and public action had actually boosted the company's reputation enormously. Customer loyalty increased. New bookings surged. The stock price had stabilized at record highs. But more than financial success, the culture had shifted. Employees knew, without question, that discrimination would not be tolerated. Anonymous reporting mechanisms had been established. Body cameras were being rolled out for all crew members on a trial basis. A passenger bill of rights was printed on every seatback card. Erin had used the incident to push through changes he'd been considering for years but had worried might be seen as too aggressive. Now, with public sentiment firmly on his side, he'd had the political capital to implement them all. Adriana Thompson had used the settlement money to establish a foundation called Aiden's Sky. Its mission was to support families who experience discrimination while traveling, providing legal assistance, counseling services, and advocacy. She'd partnered with autism awareness organizations to create travel guides for parents of children with special needs. She'd become a national speaker, telling her and Aiden's story at conferences and corporate events. The demand for her talks was so high she'd had to reduce her hours at the hospital. Aiden himself, now 8 years old, had shown remarkable resilience. The incident hadn't traumatized him as deeply as Adriana had feared, partly because of the immediate support they'd received, partly because of the counseling they'd engaged in, and partly because Aiden had an innate optimism that even cruelty couldn't fully diminish. He'd become a minor advocate himself, speaking to children's groups about kindness and difference. Aaron Mitchell had declined most interview requests, though he'd given one long-form interview to a major news program. The interviewer had asked the question everyone wanted answered. Do you regret how you handled things? Do you wish you protected your daughter? Aaron had been quiet for a long moment before responding. I regret that I didn't see the signs earlier. I regret that I gave her privilege without teaching her responsibility. I regret that she grew up disconnected from the struggles that shaped me. But do I regret firing her? Do I regret calling the police? No. If I'd protected her, I would have been telling that little boy and his mother that their pain mattered less than my daughter's comfort. I would have been saying that power protects its own, even when its own are wrong. I built this company on the principle that everyone deserves dignity. I couldn't make an exception just because the person violating that principle was my blood. The interviewer had pressed. But she's your daughter. Don't you love her? Aaron's eyes had filled with tears for the first time in the interview. I love her more than anything in this world. And that's exactly why I had to do what I did. Real love means holding people accountable. Real love means not allowing them to become monsters just because you can't bear to discipline them. I failed her for 28 years by giving her everything without teaching her what matters. The loving thing was to finally, hold her accountable. I just wish I'd done it sooner, before she hurt someone. The viral impact of Flight 447 couldn't be overstated. It had become a case study in business schools under titles like Leadership in Crisis, When Family and Principle Collide. It was analyzed in psychology courses as an example of privilege and prejudice. It was debated in ethics classes at law schools. Some professors held Aaron up as a model of moral courage. Others argued he'd been unnecessarily cruel, that public humiliation of his daughter was excessive. Aaron didn't engage with the debate. He'd made his choice, he'd live with it. What mattered to him was that other airlines were changing policies, that other CEOs were being forced to think about discrimination in their companies, that people were talking about bias and accountability in ways they hadn't before. Federal investigators had opened a broader inquiry into airline discrimination following Flight 447. Complaints that had been buried or dismissed were being reviewed. New regulations were being proposed. It was slow, bureaucratic work, but it was happening. The incident had become a catalyst. One child's pain, one father's courage, and suddenly the whole system was being questioned. It wouldn't fix everything. Racism was too deeply entrenched for one incident to eradicate. But it was something. A crack in the facade. A moment where justice had prevailed, even if imperfectly, even if at great cost. 6 months passed in a blur of media coverage, legal proceedings, and personal reckonings. Abigail Mitchell served her time in a county jail facility that was nothing like the privileged life she'd known. She shared a cell with women whose lives had been hard from the start, women who'd made mistakes born of desperation rather than entitlement. They didn't treat her gently. The other inmates knew who she was, what she'd done. Some taunted her. Others simply ignored her. She kept to herself, reading books, attending mandatory therapy sessions, and slowly, painfully, beginning to confront what she'd become. The counselor assigned to her, a black woman named Aileen in her 40s, didn't coddle her. You're here because you thought being white and rich meant you could hurt a black child without consequences, Aileen said during their first session. You were wrong. Now you have to decide if you're going to learn from this or just wait it out and go back to being the same person. Abigail was released on a cold December morning. She walked out of the jail to find her mother waiting but not her father. The absence hurt more than she wanted to admit. She moved back into her mother's apartment, a pariah with no prospects. Every job application she submitted was rejected. Her name brought up thousands of search results, none of them good. She attended anger management classes as required by her probation. She began her community service hours at a youth center in a low-income neighborhood, working with children whose lives were shaped by violence, poverty, and systemic racism. It was humbling. These kids had faced more hardship by age 10 than Abigail had faced in her entire life. 2 weeks after her release, an envelope arrived in the mail. Hand-addressed, no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with an address and a time. Coffee shop, tomorrow, 2 p.m. It was signed simply, Adriana. Abigail's first instinct was panic. Why would the woman whose son she'd hurt want to meet? Was this some kind of trap? But curiosity and maybe something like hope made her go. She arrived early, nervous, scanning the coffee shop for threats that didn't exist. When Adriana walked in with Aiden, Abigail's throat closed. The boy looked happy, healthy. He didn't seem to recognize her. They sat down at a corner table, Aiden immediately pulling out a sketch pad and colored pencils. Adriana's expression was neutral. Not angry, not forgiving. Just watching. I didn't come here to forgive you, she said without preamble. I'm not sure I can, and you shouldn't expect me to. But I came because I want to understand. I want to know how someone could do what you did. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. I don't have a good answer. I was angry. He knocked over the tray. But that's not really why I did it. I think I've been angry for a long time at everyone who I thought didn't deserve what they had. And he was this kid in first class, and I just assumed he didn't belong there. I assumed his mother didn't belong there. Because they were black. And I didn't even realize that's what I was thinking until after. But it was. Her voice broke. I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't undo what I did. But I am sorry. They talked for 2 hours. Adriana asked hard questions. Why did you think we didn't belong? Where did you learn to see black people that way? What did your father teach you? Abigail answered as honestly as she could, which meant admitting ugly truths about herself. That she'd grown up insulated from struggle. That she'd resented her father's focus on his past instead of appreciating what he'd built. That she'd made casual racist jokes and never thought about their impact. That she'd seen black people and made assumptions about their intelligence, their behavior, their worth. Saying it aloud, to this woman she'd harmed, was excruciating. But maybe that was the point. Aiden looked up from his drawing. He studied Abigail for a long moment, head tilted. Are you the lady from the airplane? Adriana tensed, ready to intervene, but Aiden's tone was curious, not fearful. Abigail nodded, unable to speak. Aiden held up his drawing. It showed an airplane with windows, and in each window was a stick figure person. Some were brown, some were tan, some were pale. All were holding hands across the windows. My mommy says you were sad inside and that made you do something bad. Are you still sad? The simple question broke something in Abigail. Tears streamed down her face. Yes, she whispered. I'm very sad. Aiden considered this. When I'm sad, I draw pictures. Or I hum. Maybe you should try that instead of hurting people. His matter-of-fact tone, the absence of malice, the innocent wisdom of it, shattered what little composure Abigail had left. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Adriana reached across the table, not to comfort but to get Abigail's attention. Look at me. Abigail looked up. My son just showed you more grace than you deserve. More grace than you showed him. I want you to think about that. I want you to understand that the kindness he's offering you is something he learned from his community, from his family, from his experiences. Not from privilege. Not from comfort. From love and strength. Abigail nodded, unable to form words. Adriana continued. I run a foundation now. We help families who experience discrimination while traveling. We also run training programs for airline employees, teaching them how to recognize and combat their own biases. I want you to share your story with those programs. Abigail's eyes widened. You want me to talk about what I did? Adriana nodded. I want you to be a cautionary tale. I want other flight attendants to hear from someone who ruined her life through prejudice. I want them to see the consequences. But more than that, I want you to do the work of changing. Not because it'll make you feel better. Not because it'll redeem you in my eyes or anyone else's. But because it's the right thing to do. You hurt my son. You can't undo that. But you can try to prevent others from doing the same. Are you willing to do that? It would be painful. It would be humiliating. It would mean reliving her worst moment again and again in front of strangers. But Abigail nodded. Yes. I'll do it. Over the following months, Abigail became an unexpected fixture in Adriana's foundation work. She spoke at training sessions, her voice shaking at first, then growing steadier. She detailed her thought process that day, the assumptions she'd made, the casual racism that had been so normalized in her mind she hadn't even recognized it. She didn't ask for sympathy or forgiveness. She just told the truth. Some attendees were hostile. One flight attendant called her evil. Abigail had nodded. Maybe. But evil isn't always people who think they're doing bad things. Sometimes it's people who think they're right. The flight attendant had fallen silent, uncomfortable. Aaron had kept his distance for months, unsure how to reconcile his love for his daughter with his disgust for her actions. But he'd been following her work with the foundation, reports from Adriana, videos of her training sessions. Finally, he'd reached out. They met at a quiet restaurant, sitting across from each other in a booth, the weight of everything between them. I'm proud that you're trying to grow, Aaron said carefully. That's all I ever wanted for you. To understand that privilege comes with responsibility. Abigail met his eyes. I hate what I did. I hate that I hurt that child. But I think I hate more that it took losing everything for me to see how wrong I was. What does that say about me? Aaron was quiet for a long moment. It says you're human. We all like to think we do the right thing, but most of us need consequences to actually change. I'm not going to tell you you're redeemed. You're not. Redemption isn't a destination. It's a direction. You're pointing the right way now. That's something. They didn't hug. The relationship was too damaged for easy affection. But it was a beginning. Aaron picked up the check, and as they left, he said quietly, Your mother told me you're paying for therapy out of pocket because your probation-required sessions weren't enough. I'd like to help with that cost. Abigail shook her head. No. I need to handle this myself. But thank you for offering. 1 year after Flight 447, Transatlantic Airways held a memorial service at their headquarters. It wasn't a memorial for a death, but for a moment that had changed everything. Aiden stood on a stage in front of hundreds of employees, now 8 years old, holding a microphone that was slightly too big for him. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying through the sound system. A lady hurt me because my skin is brown. She didn't see me as a kid. She just saw something she didn't like. But you know what? Lots of people helped me after. People who saw me. Just me. A kid who was scared on an airplane. They didn't see my color first. They saw a person. I hope that lady learned to see people too. Not colors. Just people. The auditorium erupted in applause. Aiden smiled, a little embarrassed by the attention, and handed the microphone back to his mother. In the back row, unnoticed by most, Abigail sat quietly. She hadn't been invited to the stage, wasn't part of the program. But Adriana had told her she could attend if she wanted. She'd come, needing to see Aiden thriving, needing to witness the community that had formed around this moment. As people filed out after the ceremony, she saw a young black boy struggling with a heavy backpack. Her first instinct, the one that had ruled her for so long, whispered judgment. But she pushed it down and walked over. Can I help you with that? The boy looked up, surprised. Really? Abigail smiled. Really? She adjusted the straps, making it easier for him to carry. His mother approached, thanking her. Abigail nodded. It's what anyone should do. She left the building and stood outside in the Atlanta sun. It was warm, the sky bright blue. She thought about her father, who'd built an empire from nothing. About Adriana, who'd turned her son's pain into purpose. About Aiden, who'd offered grace she didn't deserve. About all the small choices that had led to that moment on Flight 447, and all the choices since that were slowly, painfully, making her into someone different. She wasn't redeemed. She probably never would be. But she was trying. And maybe, just maybe, that mattered. Flight 447 lasted 5 hours. But its impact will last generations. This story asks us uncomfortable questions. When should we choose principle over family? How do we confront our own biases? Can people change, or are they forever defined by their worst moments? Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Should Abigail have received a second chance, or should some actions be unforgivable? Comment number 1 if you believe redemption is always possible, or comment number 2 if you think some lines can't be uncrossed. And if this story made you think, even just a little, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because we're telling stories that matter, stories that challenge us, stories that refuse to look away from hard truths. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Justice isn't always pretty. Accountability isn't always fair. But sometimes, the only way to clear the air is to crash through the storm. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking. And remember, every choice we make ripples outward in ways we can't always predict. Choose wisely. Choose kindness. Choose to see people, not assumptions. Until next time, take care of each other out there. This story reveals how privilege without accountability breeds entitlement, and how power unchecked enables discrimination to flourish. Abigail's actions weren't spontaneous, they were the culmination of years of unchallenged biases, microaggressions normalized as humor, and assumptions about who belongs were based solely on skin color. Her father's decision teaches us that true love sometimes means allowing consequences, not shielding loved ones from the results of their choices. Aaron chose justice over comfort, demonstrating that principles must apply universally or they mean nothing. The story also highlights bystander complicity. Ada's silence wasn't neutrality, it was participation. Captain Abraham's desire to avoid confrontation enabled abuse. Their fates remind us that witnessing injustice without action makes us accomplices. Conversely, Adelaide's courage shows that speaking up, even when difficult, defines character. Adriana's strength illustrates how victims of discrimination often carry the burden of education and advocacy, transforming personal trauma into systemic change. Aiden's grace demonstrates that children often understand fundamental human dignity better than adults corrupted by prejudice. The broader lesson is that racism thrives in environments where it faces no real cost. Swift, public accountability disrupts that pattern. Change requires more than policy. It demands cultural transformation where discrimination is met with immediate, meaningful consequences. Only then can we build spaces where everyone, regardless of race, experiences genuine dignity and safety. What would you have done in Aaron's position? Would you choose your child or choose justice? Comment number 1 if you believe he made the right choice, or comment number 2 if you think family should come first no matter what. If this story opened your eyes to how everyday racism manifests in places we trust, smash that like button. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're bringing you more stories that challenge us to be better, to see clearer, to act braver. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that silence in the face of discrimination is a choice, and it's the wrong one. Let's start conversations that matter. Let's hold ourselves and others accountable. Thank you for watching, for thinking, for caring enough to engage with difficult truths. May we all find the courage to choose what's right over what's comfortable, and may we build a world where children like Aiden never have to fear hatred disguised as authority. Until next time, stay kind, stay aware, and never stop fighting for justice.